Awesome. Thank you so much to coming to one of our masterclasses at the Futures Law faculty, especially in the cold Cape Town winter. That door is... Okay, so we're here today to talk about blockchain, something that we're all obviously very interested in. The thing with new technologies are, for most of our life, we try to imagine things, but we can only imagine things that we know. We don't seem to have the vocabulary to imagine things that we don't know. If you can all recall the first time you held a cell phone in your hand, you got addicted to playing Snake. And it was a really awesome thing to have in your hand, but you could never anticipate what the world of smartphones would open up to you, because if you weren't in phones or in technology, it's not the language that we think in. So you only think of your phone in context of the one in your hand and all the phones you've known before. We can't anticipate something else. So when a new technology enters and that we don't understand, like we have with blockchain, we try to dismiss it very often, or we try to relate it to something else. So you think, okay, it must be the internet, or it must be like email, or what is it? Because we don't get it. Some of us in 2008, probably not many of us, started hearing about blockchain. It's been around since 2008, and some of us might have bought bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies. I mean, by 2018, there were already 16,000 of them around, and we might have lost money. Some of us might have gotten out early enough, but we never thought that blockchain was anything beyond a cryptocurrency, and we still aren't completely sure as lawyers what that means. When I say blockchain to most people, they think, oh, cryptocurrencies, yeah, we need to talk about how we're going to regulate it. But we don't understand blockchain as a technology. So Gartner has this thing called the hype cycle that many of you might know about, where they map new technology through a kind of a hype cycle. It starts with innovation, it goes up, everyone goes crazy. Remember, about 3 years ago, blockchain was on every headline all over the world. And then it falls off, and it goes through a disillusionment phase where all of a sudden we start thinking, it was all the rage and nothing has really come off it. Gartner has now placed blockchain in that disillusionment phase. And this is a funny thing, because it gives us time to really sit around as lawyers and think, while people are gearing up to use blockchain, how are we going to use blockchain? Because it's following the exact trend that all other technologies follow. It's not going anywhere. It's just how are we going to use it? But I'm a futurist, do not understand blockchain. It is something that breaks my brain. So if you'll indulge me, I got a 2-minute clip that I want to show you, because I think many of you, not all of you, I know many of you are way smarter. This is kind of, as lawyers, how we view technology. So if you're cool for a 2-minute clip, okay. It will make you feel at home. It makes me feel way better.
We're surrounded by technology, but we don't really know how it works, right? We think because we're at the very breaking edge of all technology that somehow we're geniuses. If we ever fell back in time, fell through a wormhole and landed in Renaissance Italy, and we landed in front of a council of the finest minds of the time, Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Michelangelo, and we think we'd be gods. They would look to us and go, my God, and we'd jumpstart science. We'd be a wonder of the age. We'd tell them things they would never have heard of. It'd be incredible. No, we're 3 questions away from looking like fucking Egypts. Question 1, what do you have in the future? Traveler in time? And you go, we have an amazing thing called a computer. A computer sits in the room, and we have these in all houses in the world, and it sends information all over the world, and it draws information in. My God, they say sketching furiously. That is amazing. And how does it keep going? Well, it's connected to the wall by a cable. And what happens there? I don't really know, to be honest. They've tried to explain it to me any number of times. I've never really got it, to be honest. Basically, there's a thing that lives in the wall, and it makes the pictures change. That's the gist of it, anyway. They are walking away at this stage, and you're clutching, you go, wait. Oh, no, we have a thing called a fridge in the future. A fridge is an amazing machine because it keeps cold on the inside, and we can put food into it, and it doesn't rot, and that means we are healthier for longer, and they're like, that's amazing, and how does it work? It hums. And And the humming is in some way related to the code. And what keeps it humming? That's connected to the walls. Is this the same thing that made the pictures change? Could be. Could you imagine explaining a toaster to Michelangelo? You take a piece of bread, you put it into the machine, you press down, and you wait. And what happens? Does it double the bread, quadruple the bread? Does it change the bread into other food stuff, just ending hunger? Does this machine stop famine? No, it just makes toast. But we can make toast. We hold bread up next to a flame on a fork. But this does two sides. 500 years of science and advancement, and you can make two-sided toast. I like two-sided toast. And what keeps the machine hot? It's connected to the walls.
Right, so if you're like me, I also think the fax machine and all those things, I have no idea technically how they work. So that's why we have to engage and collaborate with experts that actually know this as lawyers. And so as the Futures Law faculty, we went around and we looked for the smartest person we could find. And we found Tanya Knowles. She's part of the Singularity University. She is chairperson of the South African Financial Blockchain Consortium that comprises of 50 members, including the country's largest banks and financial institutions and regulators. She consults with law firms and startups. We literally could not find someone smarter than her to tell you about blockchain. Tanya, please come up. After Tanya does her 40-minute, 42-an-hour presentation, we'll do some questions, and you're welcome to ask anything during that Q&A session. Thanks so much.
Jackie, thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I can hear that you can all hear me. Is that right? Okay, excellent. It's wonderful to be here and to be talking about my absolutely favorite subject, which is about blockchain. And essentially, I try and keep quite a realistic view about whether it's really going to change the world or not. I think that there's a lot of hype around it, and I think we have to sometimes keep our feet on the ground about the topic. And the other thing is also, many people tout it as sort of a cure for cancer, that it's going to resolve everything, we're going to automate everything in our lives, and I think that some of that rhetoric is also not 100% correct. So I hope to give you a bit of an accurate view tonight. I'm hoping that when you walk out of the room tonight, you will have a good understanding about what this technology is about and exactly how it works, and then potentially how it might impact the legal profession going into the future. There's a Peruvian economist called Carlota Perez, and she's done some amazing studies that says that we have a technology revolution that happens roughly every 40 to 60 years. And the interesting part about these revolutions is they occur with remarkable regularity. And the other thing is that they happen in a very predictable fashion. So in terms of that remarkable regularity, we've had the age of steam, we've had steel, and the most recent one being the IT and telecommunications industry that came onto the scene in the 1970s. And if you look at this regularity, we're really due for the next technology wave or the next technology revolution. And the question on many people's lips is that could that potentially be cryptocurrencies, and could that potentially be blockchain that could change the world? The other thing about these revolutions is that they occur with remarkable regularity, or in a predictable fashion, I should say. So there's this phase of eruption. You then have something called a frenzy sort of era. There's a huge crash where regulation steps in, and then you enter what is called the golden age and a period of synergy. And I think what's interesting is when I first used to look at these graphs, I thought that when Bitcoin crashed about 18 months ago, that was probably the crash stage. But when you actually analyze this sort of period takes probably a bit longer. It's in a period of 15 to 20 years that you go through these rise and falls of the technology. And tonight what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through a journey of discovery. So we're going to cover, first of all, just a little bit about Bitcoin. We're then going to get into the blockchain. We'll get into distributed ledger technology. I'm going to discuss some of the concepts around initial coin offerings, security tokens, exchange tokens, because what's happening is that this phase and this technology is evolving so quickly, and it's really one phase is growing on top of the next, and I want to try and create a story about how this has evolved over the last 10 years or so. So in the beginning, so cover Bitcoin just to start off with. In the beginning, we've really had no way to transfer anything of value over the internet without going through a trusted independent party. So think about it. If I have a photograph on my phone and I want to send it to Jackie, I can send it to her. Now, I have a copy of that photo and she has a copy of that photo. You obviously can't do that with money, because if I have 10 Rand and I send 10 Rand to Jackie, now we both have 10 Rand and it's the same 10 Rand. So what we've had to do up until now is we've always had to go through an intermediary. We've had to go through a bank who's kept a record to say, right, Tanya has sent that 10 Rand to Jackie. She no longer has it. Jackie now has it instead. And we've had no way to interact in a peer-to-peer environment without going to the party. So really the gift that Bitcoin has given the world is it's allowed us to enable that peer-to-peer relationship where we don't have to rely on these intermediaries. And I don't think some of us realize how many intermediaries we use all the time. It could be the deeds office that's keeping a record of who owns what houses. It could be an organization like Straits, I worked there for 17 years, that's keeping track of who owns what shares on the stock exchange. It could be iTunes saying whether I've downloaded a song or not, whether I have the right to use that song. It might be a registrar that's keeping track of whether I'm married or not. We're actually using these trusted independent parties all the time, and we actually don't realize it. So under the pseudonym of Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009, a white paper was written, and what it enabled is a way for us to transfer value over the internet in this peer-to-peer way. And essentially what Bitcoin does, the easiest way to describe it is it's an international currency that's kept up to date through an algorithm running on computers, very much like the internet. And you can send money across the world instantaneously in less than 10 minutes. You can send money from one side of the world to the other, or value from one side of the world to the other in the form of Bitcoin over the internet. And what happens is this network of computers keeps that database up to date as to who has what Bitcoins. And if you run in one of those computers that they call nodes, there's about 10,000 of them at the moment that operate, you're incentivized to keep that network honest because you paid in Bitcoin to run one of those nodes. So when people say to me, but what happens if the nodes all conspire together and, and they go and corrupt the whole network and somebody goes and steals all the Bitcoins? There's no incentive to do that, because if you were to do that, the price would essentially drop to zero and they would become worthless. So by incentivizing the people who are running this network, by paying them in the currency that they essentially keeping secure, it keeps the whole system going all at once. And as I say, it's an international system that is essentially allowing us to move value around the world without going through those independent parties. So just very, very quickly, I'll not kill you with too many bullet points. Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer environment where we can transact in a peer-to-peer way. It's open source technology, so anybody can download it. And you can run one of these nodes or one of these mining houses, essentially, that would keep that network up to date. It's decentralized. There's 10,000 computers. You're not sitting with a central database that's open to corruption, cyber attacks, anything like that. It's decentralized across all these computers around the world. It's keeping a secure ledger of all the transactions, of who owns what Bitcoins. I've spoken a little bit about the miners and the incentives. It uses blockchain technology, which we will spend quite a bit of the talk tonight speaking about. And then at the same time, it's also very, very secure and tamper-proof. When people say to me, so-and-so's Bitcoins were stolen, or there was some guy who was running an exchange where $50 million worth of Bitcoins were stolen, the Bitcoin blockchain has never, ever been compromised. Instead, what's happened is that if somebody's Bitcoin have been stolen, the exchange that they were using has been hacked. In other words, that the exchange where those Bitcoins were sitting was not secure enough and did not have the adequate security protocols in place to keep it secure. But the Bitcoin itself and the Bitcoin blockchain to this day has never, ever been hacked. So it is extremely secure. Those 10,000 computers are competing to keep that network secure. All right. Then what happened is that people started to say, okay, hang on a second. Here we are able to transfer this international currency, this Bitcoin, around the world. What about other assets? And other ideas started to pop up. So if I take some of them, Monero, that's one that's actually driven by a community very much South African-based, a gentleman based in Plet. That is a cryptocurrency that you can use where you can transact completely anonymously, for example. There's other ones here, Litecoin. Litecoin is an example of another cryptocurrency where they're saying that Bitcoin is perhaps too slow and too expensive. So they've come up with an alternative currency that you could maybe use for smaller payments, as opposed to Bitcoin, which might be more conducive to some of the bigger ones. And then the third one that perhaps is one called Ethereum. So Ethereum is probably the second or the third largest cryptocurrency. It's the second at the moment. It fluctuates with something called XRP Ripple. But this currency is allowing what is called smart contracts. And the reason I want to touch on this, particularly for the legal fraternities, this is probably one of the biggest changes that we will see from a cryptocurrency perspective in the form of smart contracts. And what they've done is they've invented a currency where essentially the way we've been able to program Bitcoin as money, you can program other applications. So, for example, if you are an airline and somebody has gone and bought some insurance that if your flight is cancelled, you get paid by that insurance. What you would do is you would program into the currency that the following person has taken out that insurance. They would feed in some data from the airline saying this flight was delayed, and it would automatically initiate what would be called a smart contract, a programmable contract, and pay out anybody who had taken that insurance instantaneously. So there's no paperwork involved, there's no claims processes involved, and it automates it. Very similarly, I'll touch on it a bit more later on, is if you've got a very simple contract around housing, if you want to transfer from one person to the other, you could essentially put it onto the blockchain, onto something like Ethereum, and if it was a straightforward contract, you could program on X date, at X time, when the following payment is received, the transfer automatically takes place from one person to the other. So it's contracts that are really enabled through this type of technology. And then I'm going to get into a little bit about blockchain. So I think, excuse me for one sec. So as I've said to you before, that the cryptocurrency environment has enabled us to look at what other assets can we actually put onto this sort of technology. So the blockchain really is I use the term loosely, a database. It's actually more of a ledger, but it's a database of any sort of assets. It's decentralized, which means that there's no one party that has control over it. Instead, it's operating via a network of computers. Sorry, the color there is very bad. That's no central authority. Then there's a single shared ledger. So you're essentially speaking of the same source of truth. It's not one copy on a computer. Instead, there's a single copy of information, but it's residing across many computers around the world, so it's decentralized. And the other thing is it's immutable. Once a transaction has been added into that blockchain, it cannot be reversed. So people always say, what happens if there's an error? Well, essentially, if there's an error, you would have to book an equal and opposite transaction to reverse the one that's gone in. But it creates this immutable ledger that once something is in there, it cannot be reversed at any point in time and cannot be tampered with. And, very simplistically, people ask, why is it called blockchain? And I always say it's very much like taking an Excel spreadsheet. So all the transactions that have occurred in the last 10 minutes are put into one sheet, and those sheets are chained together to have this immutable record of every single block of transactions that's occurred. You can think of it like a book, that it's a page in a book, and every 10 minutes there's a new page that's added. And that's where the word blockchain comes from. It's a block of transactions that are chained together. And every single time, interestingly, in the Bitcoin example, every single time a new block is added to this, the algorithm actually has to run from the first Genesis block that was ever created. And it has to solve the algorithm to make sure that along the way, nobody has gone and tampered with the record of every transaction that's happened before. So that's why Bitcoin becomes very, very energy intensive as it goes. And it's also energy intensive because essentially instead of having one computer or one database that's keeping this record up to date, you've got thousands around the world that are doing it. So that's why it takes up a lot of energy to run the Bitcoin blockchain specifically. Okay, so what's the big deal? So I've said to you, and I highlighted some of these earlier, is that we don't actually realize how many trusted parties we're using all the time. I use the examples of Straight, iTunes, Home Affairs, the Deeds Office, a registrar, Facebook, any of these organizations. Very few people actually reflect on how many of these independent parties we're using. And people sometimes say to me, how did you get into the space? And when I was at Straight, we had a tagline that said, your trusted independent party. And that was our tagline for about 10 years. And then in 2015, there was a US newspaper that wrote a story, and the headline said, why you no longer need a trusted independent party. And our marketing department picked that up. And that's how I specifically got involved in blockchain to discover what this was about. And there are many, many trusted independent parties, banks, that are feeling hugely threatened by this technology, because for the first time, we're able to interact directly with each other instead of going through those intermediaries. And here's some examples of things of assets that are actually being put onto the blockchain. So there's anything from your marriage certificate. You can actually go and register your marriage on the blockchain as opposed to going through a registrar or Home Affairs. It's put into a smart contract, by the way, the terms and conditions of your marriage. And there was a Canadian couple who did this. They were one of the first couples to do it. And the terms and conditions of the smart contract was it was up for renewal after 5 years if the party was still happy with the arrangement. So that's how people are putting art onto the blockchain to keep a record of who owns what artworks, qualifications, your digital identity, houses, jewelry. Fascinating use cases. In the jewelry industry, for example, diamonds. They're putting diamonds onto the blockchain. And what that does is a diamond, it's called 14 metadata points, where you can trace the uniqueness of a diamond very much like a fingerprint or a snowflake. And the mining houses, the jewelers, the insurers are all getting together to say, let's put diamonds onto the blockchain, and we can trace the movement of these things, trace blood diamonds, trace if they're stolen and they reappear somebody else, trace gone and claim from insurance that a diamond was stolen, and then 5 years later they go and claim again that the same diamond was stolen. So there's some very, very interesting use cases that are coming up around technology. And then houses, a few countries, Estonia, Dubai, are looking at putting their deeds registries onto the blockchain. And then music, and that I will get into a little bit. And on this role of intermediaries, I don't think we realize how many intermediaries we also use. If you want to sell your shares on the JSE, there are 11 intermediaries in the chain that get involved for me to sell my shares to Jackie. It could be a broker, a custodian bank, a clearinghouse, a CSD, the exchange, the asset manager, depending on what the structure is. So what the blockchain essentially promises to do is it essentially allows you through technology to rather have that transaction directly with each other. And you go from this sort of diagram here with many, many organizations involved to something like this where you've just got a buyer, a seller, and you're always going to need a marketplace and an exchange to interact directly with each other. Okay. The other thing that I like to talk about is how, I'm jumping ahead by 1 or 2 slides, about how this technology is waking up some sleeping giants. And the launch of Libra, or Facebook's cryptocurrency, about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, if you follow this space closely, I've never ever seen so much publicity and headlines in this space. For those of you that don't know, what Facebook is doing is that they're launching their own international currency. What it means is that between their users, between Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, they have 2.7 billion people. That is a third of the world's population that could start using this cryptocurrency overnight. Imagine having a potential customer base that big just overnight. And what will happen is that Facebook will actually become, in a way, the biggest central bank in the world by issuing this sort of currency. I was fortunate to meet with them yesterday, and if you look, they've involved another, I think it's 28 partners, Uber, Lyft, MasterCard, Visa, a whole bunch of payment providers. And when I looked at the initial list, there was not one bank on that list. And you have to look and say, what does this actually mean, transactional banking, if every single man on the street can rather interact with using the Libra Facebook coin as opposed to using traditional payment mechanisms? What does that do for bank deposits, for the reserves that the banks are holding? And I said to Facebook, I noticed that there's no banks, and they said they were all too scared. There was no bank willing to come in phase 1 There was just too much skepticism around it. But now that it's officially been launched, they've been inundated with 68 applications for banks to become members of the consortium that they're forming around this currency. So it's a very, very interesting move for me. And for those who are skeptical about the technology and blockchain, what I say is that it's woken up an ability for us to start asking questions. For the world to say, why does it take 5 days to send money across the world? When I can send an email, I mean, money is essentially just a digital copy of information. How come I can send an email around the world and that takes but yet if I want to send money around the world, it takes 5 to 6 days. You know, I listened to a guy, he weighed 120 kilos. He said, I can fly my 120 kilogram body faster to Singapore than it does for a bank to send a digital record of some money across the world. And I think it's a very, very interesting concept. The other thing that's happened is that people are starting to question, what is money? How come the 10 Rand in my wallet actually has any value? If we abandoned the gold standard so many years ago, what is actually backing that 10 Rand that's sitting in my wallet? And I think there's some new conversations that are coming up in the financial services industry of projects that the banks and the industry should have been doing for years. This is the part about the sleeping giant. You know, I was involved in a project around proxy voting. It's a mess in the South African market and actually around the world, around the way proxy voting should work. And a lot of the custodian banks, the asset managers have been saying for years and years, this is something that needs to be fixed. But nobody's ever really done anything about it. And what's happened is that blockchain has ignited new conversations to say, actually, here's some new technology. These projects are things we should have been doing years and years ago. Let's rather actually get them off the ground and look at them again. They don't necessarily belong on blockchain. They can be there. They don't have to be there. But at least it's starting to get some industry conversations going. The same thing with SWIFT. SWIFT has spent many, many years, you know, facilitating payments between the banks that take so long. And they've started to implement some new standards and some new models to move money far faster around the world today than we have before. So I think it's creating very exciting conversations across many spheres. All right, and then I wanted to get into one more term, and this is around distributed ledger technology. So I've tried to explain a little bit about what Bitcoin is. I've explained what blockchain is about, so just that you've got these, it's a technology underlying Bitcoin, it's peer-to-peer, you've got these miners or this consensus mechanism that's keeping this decentralized database up to date. There's blocks of data that are chained together. But then I want to throw in a third concept now called distributed ledger technology. And because blockchain has enabled this concept of a ledger, many people are saying, okay, let's take this. They're calling it blockchain. By the way, a lot of these projects are not blockchain projects. They're distributed ledger technology projects. But they're saying to industries, how can we use this technology to really mitigate risk, bring efficiencies to an industry, but it doesn't have to be open source for the whole world to see like Bitcoin. So if I use an example, here's some of the consortiums that are working on these. There's a lot of banks working on them. But if I use an example, probably the best way to describe it is to say, right, if I want to bring a car from China to South Africa, there are numerous parties involved. You've got port authorities, the shipping company, the car manufacturer, the bank who's providing the trade finance, the revenue services who want to collect tax for the import of what they're saying is, why don't we rather have what we call a distributed ledger, where we all have access to the same information and we put the import of that car onto this technology? Because right now what's happening is that all the parties that I've listed are keeping records of the same information. They're keeping records of when did the ship leave the port. You know, what is the cargo that's sitting on that ship. Apparently it's about 800 pages of documentation to bring one car into South Africa. But imagine that entire industry got together and said, right, let's come up with a system, a distributed ledger that we all have access to, where we keep one record of information about that particular car. And we don't need to start reconciling data amongst ourselves. We all have access to it. We all have the right to update it, provided consensus is reached by everybody else who has access to that database, and we can stop duplicating so many systems that we have. So there's a number of these distributed ledger technology projects that are happening around the world in this area. The medical fraternity are looking at it. As I say, the shipping industry is looking at it. Banks themselves are building these permission things around trade finance, syndicated loans, all sorts of stuff like that, where they can essentially share the same database of information, and all those parties have an equal viewing and an equal say into it and how it works. Okay. All right, and then I wanted to get into initial coin offerings. Now, I love this space, and it's as dodgy as anything, all right? But initial coin offerings really arose out of the cryptocurrency era. We went through a huge boom in 2017 where there were thousands of them that came onto the market and people were buying them up. But I wanted to describe just what they're about and what they lead into, because they lead into something more serious than just the dodgy schemes of 2017. So, if I take, for example, if I wanted to start a laundromat in my area, okay, and I don't have money to do that, I could then go and publish a paper on the internet, and I could say, right, I would like to build a laundromat in Cape Town. Who lives in this area and would like to fund that? And anybody in that area who had seen the white paper could essentially give me a cryptocurrency. They could give me Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of the coins that I was accepting, and I would get that money up front. And in exchange, I would give you tokens to use the washing machines once that laundromat is up and running. Okay? And then, the theory is I would build the laundromat, and you could all come and do your washing there. Or what you could do is go and exchange those tokens or sell those tokens to somebody else in the neighborhood, potentially at a higher price later on for anybody else who had not got in early to use that washing machine. And this was the concept, and you can see that what you did is you didn't give any equity away in your business. The person had no voting rights. You owed them nothing. You essentially just got early customers to come into a network and use your product and service. The other example I use, which I think could be so relevant in South Africa, is Eskom could do this. If they wanted to build a power station, they could say to people, right, we're building a new power station. Who wants to buy electricity tokens up front? And you will be able to use them once the power station is built at a cheaper price than what electricity is going for at the time, or you could sell to people who needed to use the electricity at the time. So this was a fundraising mechanism and really an unregulated means of crowdfunding where you would raise money via a cryptocurrency. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs had very good intentions around what they wanted to do in this space. But the space sort of got carried away where there were a huge number of Ponzi schemes, fly-by-night schemes that existed, because some of them were 23-year-old entrepreneurs who had gone and raised like $10 million worth of funding for their startup, and now you've got the long, hard slog of building a business or run into Bermuda with the money. And that's what happened to a lot of them. The biggest one raised close to $4 billion US, EOS. And I say, imagine you're an entrepreneur and you get $4 billion to start your business before you've developed your first product. And the big ones are still going, they're still building those products, but some of them are very, very exciting around this concept of ICOs. And I know that I think a lot of people in the legal fraternity were inundated with requests at the time of South Africans who had ideas about businesses they wanted to get off the ground. And they started to get into gray areas of the law around this, which I'll touch on now. So I'm not going to go through all the details here, but really it is an unregulated means of crowdfunding that you would raise the money in the form of a cryptocurrency, and essentially you got access to a network or to a business in future on the future promise that entrepreneur would essentially get that business off the ground. I love this quote from Bagehot and Andreessen Horowitz. He says, "The rise of all these new tokens and public blockchains means the internet will, in the long term, become by far the biggest stock market once the regulatory issues have been worked through, just as it has become the biggest library." And I think it's a very, very exciting time to be here. And as I said, it is going through a bad patch at the moment. But once the regulatory issues are worked through, I think this could be a very, very exciting business model for a lot of companies. I want to give you just two quick examples So let me actually start with the second one first. So this is called the basic attention token. So what happens here is that right now Facebook and Google generate 78% of all advertising revenue on the internet goes to those two organizations. And what this token has done, or what this ICO did, is that they are essentially developing a browser that you can download, where anybody who advertises on that browser, if you consume that advert, so if you click on it, if you watch the video, anything like that, you get paid for consuming the advert as opposed to Facebook or Google. And you can then go and take those tokens that you've earned by watching that advert, and you can go and spend them either in this ecosystem. You yourself could advertise your business. If you, for example, if you're a journalist, you could go and publish content on here, and anybody who goes and reads that content will pay you for that content, as opposed to paying the media house for that content. Perhaps the same could apply to the legal profession, that if you've gone and written a journal article, as opposed to the journal getting the revenue from that article, you would actually receive the revenue from that article. So this was an interesting concept. It's called the basic attention token, and it's doing very, very well still. And the other one which I wanted to touch on is the same thing with your medical data. Right now, so many of us are walking around with smart watches, and who is getting that data? Your medical insurer is getting that data right now, and some of them are on selling that data to pharmaceutical companies. The idea with this particular token is that you would be able to connect your watch to a platform where the pharmaceutical company would pay you directly for your medical data, as opposed to paying the intermediaries or the insurers sitting in the middle. And there are thousands and thousands of ideas like this around how we enable this peer-to-peer economy. And essentially what this is doing is it's really creating new asset class. You know, up until now, we've had things like property and equities and bonds and things and gold, etc. But really, people are starting to see a new asset class in the form of these new tokens that are actually worth something, and hopefully could potentially be used for collateral for some of the people in poorer areas in the long run, to secure some funding. So that's the long-term vision of a lot of these tokens, is that poorer people would be able to use them as collateral to have access to formal financial services. Okay, and then the next step is so these ICOs, a lot of them started to touch on gray areas. So, you know, I said to you that if you got access to these tokens, your tokens to use the washing machine, or you know, your health data or things like that. But a lot of these tokens started to infringe particularly on US securities law. And that law always applies to something called the Howey test. It's based on in the 1940s around the definition of a security. And really what happened was that there were two brothers. The Howey brothers, they owned a tract of land in Florida, and they sold off tracts of land to prospective investors, and they went and farmed some oranges on that land. And they went and got a letter from the SEC at the time, the Securities and Exchange Commission, saying that this is a security. And the definition used to apply that is, they said, anything that is an investment of money, so there were investors who had invested in this farm or this piece of land, so it's an investment of money in a enterprise. It was one big farm with I've lost it. An investment of money in a common enterprise with an expectation of profits. So you were going to make money off the oranges that were farmed, that the profits were due to the efforts of a third party. So if you had bought in this land and you weren't farming it, but the brothers were instead, you weren't contributing at all, but rather the third party was doing it, that was deemed to be a security. And so what's happened in this ICO phase is that the SEC got many of these ICOs saying that test people were investing money, be it Bitcoin or Ethereum, in a common enterprise. There was an expectation of profits, that you could sell your tokens at a higher price, and you were not putting in any effort yourself. The effort was as a result of the entrepreneur or the third party. So they started to get in trouble around that. What's happened is that in terms of South African law, securities have a very, very specific definition. And there's been many, many people here in South Africa who've come and spoken to me to say, can I do an ICO, or can I do what is now becoming very popular, a security token? And what I always say to them is the reason we currently have 5 exchanges in South Africa, the JSE operated as a sole exchange for over 100 years, but the reason we have 5 exchanges right now is that some of them, not all of them, but some of them essentially were offering securities that were publicly traded, and they didn't have a license to do that. And as soon as you have publicly traded securities in South Africa, they need to be settled through, they need to go through an authorized exchange. There's 5 of them, the JSE, Easy Equities, Equity Express, A2X, 4AX, and ZARX. You need to be going to one of those 5 registered exchanges. If you go through one of those exchanges, the securities have to settle through an authorized CSD. There's 2 of them, Straight and Granite. You need to go through an authorized custodian bank. There's 7 of them. And you need to be trading those securities through an authorized broker. So in South Africa, it's very, very difficult for somebody to be doing one of these ICOs or one of these security tokens unless you're following the traditional mechanisms in the country of going through a proper IPO. And anybody who comes to you and says, you know, I want to do one of these ICOs or I want to do one of these security token projects, I always say to people, please refer to the FMA and just make sure that what you are doing is legal. Because the law, a lot of people base it on the law in the US, thinking that they can do the same thing here, and it's not actually legal in South Africa to do it like that. So, so just the security token markets, as I say, a lot of ICOs are actually security, starting to apply in the US for authorization as a security, and there's a huge potential market here. They estimate somewhere around $10 trillion worth of securities that could enter these markets based on the US definition that I've given, not the South African one. And the other thing is I always look and say, well, I love this to say that the barons of just over 10, 15 years ago now, placed by Silicon Valley. And this for me is fascinating that the top companies by market cap in the US in 2006 were the likes of Total and Exxon, and now the ones with the biggest market cap are essentially the IT companies coming out of Silicon Valley. So I think that this could be a future way of fundraising around security tokens. Okay, so how much time do I have left? Sorry, sorry, a few minutes. Okay. I'm gonna just quickly touch on some applications around blockchain and the law. So because Ethereum has a smart contracting layer, a lot of lawyers are taking a very keen interest in how Ethereum works. And there's an organization called the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. They've got, I think it's close to 600 or 700 members now. And I read a stat to say that 25% of the top law firms in the world are all members of that Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. And it's not particularly onerous to become a member. You get access to some amazing information, data, if you are a member of that organization. At the same time, there's also the Global Legal Blockchain Consortium, and what this consortium is doing, same sort of principles, any organization can join, any registered firm of attorneys can join, and what they're trying to do is implement standards around how blockchain will work, and how smart contracts will work, and how the technology will work. So they're very much a standard setting body from a legal perspective in this space. The other thing is that there's, I've touched on some of these. So we've seen a shift where there's this question around in future, given the smart contracting applications. And I gave the example about the paperwork involved to verify selling a house. But the principle of what I want to try and get through on this slide is that I think there's going to be a shift where there will be a far more proactive role that lawyers are going to play up front in defining the terms of a contract. So if something is put into a smart contract, that is the role that you're going to have to play. Relationship around if something has gone wrong. I think there will be a huge focus on trying to make sure that the terms and conditions up front in that smart contract are essentially correct and executable and right, as opposed to dealing with the backlash afterwards when things go wrong. And when people say that, oh, blockchain's going to get rid of lawyers, if you've ever, well, you've all looked at legal agreements, but there's one page that sort of covers if things go right, this is how it works, and then there's 180 pages that deals with what happens when things go wrong. And what I say is it's very, very difficult to program what happens when things go wrong into an IT program. So I don't think that the legal fraternity are out of work just because blockchains come along. I don't think it's going to be as simple as that. There's far more complexities around that. The other thing is what happens if there's a bug in the system? You can go and program that on X date, Y is going to happen, and on Y date, so-and-so will be paid, etc. What happens if a bug starts to run and, the entire system gets corrupted or gets out of control? I think that these are some of the things that people need to look at very seriously before we start to see mainstream adoption around the use of smart contracts. The other thing that I think blockchain will be very useful is the verification of data. And what will happen is I think we'll start to see a shift where the blockchain will become recognized as a source of truth. So if I use an example, by the way, this is my husband's car. So car written off after flood and reinvented and resold as fine twice. So this was in the Sunday Times 2 weeks ago. My husband's car was in a flood at the Linksfield off-ramp in Johannesburg. It essentially got washed away. There was sand in the engine for those who can see. And it was written off by Alexander Forbes at the time. A car dealer went and bought it, refurbished it, and went and sold it twice to another owner. The second owner, the car broke down within an hour of the person getting it, and the dealership said there was absolutely nothing wrong with the car. After 2 years of fighting a legal battle to try and fix the car, the electric windows weren't working. And he removed the door panel, and he found my husband's business card in the door panel. And he phoned him and said, "Do you know anything about this car?" And my husband said, "Yes, it was written off. It was in a flood, it washed away, it was written off." And this guy had spent 2 years trying to fight a legal battle to find that bit of information, and he found it by finding a dirty business card in the door. So by putting these sort of assets onto the blockchain, you're essentially creating through the examples of that provenance, you're creating a data source where you can trace assets, who's owned them, where they've come from, that provenance around it. And what happens is that your blockchain becomes that single source of truth for people to log into and have access to. So I think that this could be something that could be quite interesting and important. And it also brings into question what happens to public notaries, because this is very much the function that some of them perform, is the verification of documentation or things like that. So essentially the technology could replace those sort of functions. Identity is another one. I think that we've all, many of you would have experienced it between KYC, GDPR, POPI. The implications and the paperwork and the admin around some of these things has been huge. But by putting people's identity onto the blockchain, what happens is that organizations, a person becomes the owner of their own identity. And all the blockchain does is it validates that you are who you say you are. So I use the example is if you go into a bar and if your identity is on the blockchain, it doesn't validate that you were born on the following day and this is your physical address and etc. It just validates whether you are over 18. That's all the barman needs to know is, are you over 18 or not? The same sort of thing would exist if you needed to fika somebody. It would just validate that you are who you say you are and give you any information that you would need to have related to that particular thing. So this is a huge, huge, huge project. The South African Financial Blockchain Consortium is trying to resolve some of these things to try and streamline the KYC processes within the banks. It's really proving to be very, very challenging, but if you understand the blockchain space, your first point of entry is your identity. For you to interact on who owns the car, well, you need to have the person's identity there to start with. Any of these provenance type of things, you have to have identity around it. So this is one of the big things that many, many people in the world are focusing on. And in theory, if we were to get it right, you would never ever fill in a form ever again with your name, your ID number, your address, your cell phone number, etc. You would instead have an app and give somebody access to the data, just the bits of data that they would need, as opposed to filling in all those forms. Intellectual property protection and microtransactions. So this peer-to-peer economy, I described it in the form of the basic attention token, but this peer-to-peer economy is doing huge things for musicians, for artists, for journalists, for anybody, that essentially what you do is you put your asset, it could be a song, onto the blockchain. And if somebody downloads that song, you get paid automatically for that. If you are a photographer and you've gone and put your photographic work up, you would essentially be paid if anybody downloaded that photo and wanted to use it for rights in an advertising campaign or anything like that. You would be able to load anything that's based on your own IP and your own intellectual rights directly onto this without going through those intermediaries, be it Getty Images or iTunes in terms of the music store. So that's quite an exciting one around the ownership and the management of IP rights. And then I think that there's an opportunity for lawyers to specialize in blockchain technology. There's issues around how do you achieve settlement finality? How do you decide whether which version of the ledger is the truth? Can it be this decentralized ledger? How does it work if you can't hold one party responsible if something goes wrong? How does decentralized governance work? I didn't touch on that tonight, but it's also becoming very popular among some of these ICOs. They're working with decentralized governance where you don't have one party in charge, but rather it's a community of people who are driving the process and the adoption of that. How can the governance around that work? So I think that there's opportunities for attorneys to get involved, and then you're always going to have clients wanting to come to you to say, how can I do an ICO, or how can I create a cryptocurrency, and how can I get involved in some of these other spaces around this? So I think you've got, many of the laws are unwritten right now, and essentially they're sitting there waiting for people to come up with ideas of how these things could work. I think we'll touch a little bit on what we're doing in South Africa, but in other jurisdictions in the world, particularly in some of the tax havens and in other countries like Malta, Switzerland, etc., they're really embracing this and trying to get their countries to be positioned as blockchain islands, they call it, where they get entrepreneurs to come and build products and services in their countries and incentivize them to be moving into this space. And one final closing thought is that, very often banks and regulators and all of that are pushing back against trying to stop all these things happening and saying, we need, for example, when Facebook announced their coin, they've already received a letter from the US Senate saying that they want to see them. So Mark Zuckerberg's going to be back explaining uneloquently what the Libra coin is about. But I think that this decentralized world, it's very difficult to stop something like Bitcoin. It's very difficult to stop something like these ICOs from operating. And I think what organizations and banks should be doing is, instead of trying to stop it, or instead of taking your existing business model and just trying to apply blockchain technology on top of it, what you actually have to do is anticipate that your clients are going to operate in this new decentralized world in future. And how do you help them do that? And what products and services can you offer to help them have self-sovereign identity, to help them, transfer their house over a blockchain as opposed to the deeds office? How can you enable that sort of world, as opposed to trying to just say, okay, let's put the deeds office on a blockchain and tick the box? It's a whole new world and a whole new way of doing things. How can you help your clients move to that peer-to-peer environment in future? I think that's really what it's about. Okay. Thank you. Oh. This is me photobombing a picture with Vitalik Buterin. So he's the inventor of Ethereum. He came up with it, I think he was 19 years old at the time, and he's completely socially awkward, but a real genius. And that is him wearing a unicorn t-shirt, yes.
I've compiled a few questions from the survey. We ran a survey and we got some amazing questions from some of you. So I know people don't always want to ask in an audience, so I thought I'll take like the top 5 questions and just ask Tanya that. Is there anyone that has a question at the moment?
You mentioned a lot about with the smart contracts and the risk of corruption and things like that, and viruses and stuff like that. I mean, they're all based on blockchain, and blockchain is really around 10,000 computers around the world. Is there not risk with regards to somebody sending a virus into that? And I mean, the more we become reliant on blockchain, that it could be destroyed and cause a massive collapse that could be earthquake related.
So, look, I think that there's aspects to it. So, in theory, because you've got so many computers running this decentralized network, in theory, it's supposed to be more safe than having one entity that could go down. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to attack 10,000 computers at the same time. But at the same time, if there is a bug in the system and it does start to run away, what happens with that? And I mean, it's already happened. So Ethereum had a bug in 2016, I think it was now, or maybe it was 2017. And they ended up having to actually what they call fork the blockchain and say, all right, there was a bug here. Somebody was able to exploit it and steal Ethereum and take money out of it. And they stopped that particular chain running, and they decided to say, right, let's roll it back and say, right, let's pretend that it was like this, resolve the bug, and keep going in that way. So you'll see on some of my slides where I say that you get rid of the trusted independent parties, and I put there, I think it was the one that you couldn't see, the yellow one, and I put there theoretically. Sometimes you need some sort of governance around these systems, and it's very easy for us all to say, oh, let's get together and develop and we'll sing kumbaya, no one's in charge. But sometimes you do need some sort of leadership and somebody in charge. So what happened with Ethereum is they formed the Ethereum Alliance, the foundation, as an independent, non-profit, etc., to try and manage the governance and the upgrades that happen and make sure that the network does remain, the integrity is there and it remains intact.
So obviously, in South Africa, I think a lot of people are crippled by the cost of technology. We still live in this notion that technology is incredibly expensive, and not especially law firms. The smaller or medium law firms don't have the money for technology always. What is it's a very broad, wide question, but it was one of the questions that came up. What is the cost of using blockchain technology?
So, you know, if you're going to build one of these private permission systems, like let's say the example I used with IBM and Maersk in the shipping industry, these projects are expensive. They're not going to be cheap. But if you start to look at some sort of peer-to-peer environment, you know, people will give you a view and say, right, oh, it's for free. You can download the Bitcoin blockchain. It's free. It's open source. Same thing with Ethereum, and you can build on top of it. It really just depends on what sort of application you want to do. If it's a very, very intensive, complex type of project that needs, you know, a huge number of parties involved, etc., it is going to be expensive. If you want to build a very, very simple application where you know, let's take the example of putting registering all houses and we just transfer them with each other, and it's very, very simple. Something like that can be done cheaply, but then as soon as you start to involve estate agents or attorneys or you know, the information, it becomes the system. It becomes more expensive from that perspective.
I think we've touched on this a lot about how effectively blockchain is regulated. So that was another question that came up. Another one we have from the audience was someone said they were interested in hearing about the regulation of cryptocurrencies in South Africa specifically, as well as whether lawyers should get involved and whether they should get involved through coding or in what function.
So the SARB issued a paper in 2014 saying that basically there was no laws around this. And if you would delve in Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of these things, it was very early days of Ethereum, but if you would delve in any of these things, essentially there was nothing to protect you and you did it at your own risk. And they sort of issued a warning saying that any standard regulation around anti-money laundering, FICA, etc. applies, but because Bitcoin was not recognized as a currency, none of the laws applied to it. And then I think when the Bitcoin run happened in 2017, they started to get anxious again. So what happened was they formed something called the Intergovernmental Financial Working Group. It's made up of the FSCA, so that's the new FSB, the SARB, the FIC, SARS and National Treasury. SARS is not an official member, but they've also been involved. So they've formed this intergovernmental working group, and they've started to put together some papers around the regulation of cryptocurrencies. And the latest version came out in January this year. And essentially what it says is that they don't believe that right now it's big enough to be worried about. So at the time, I think the market cap of Bitcoin was about 200, or the market cap of the crypto asset industry was about $200 billion. They said if it ever reached $1 trillion, they would start to take more interest in it. But right now, they sort of still taking that wait and see approach. And then what they're doing is they will probably look to regulate the entry points. So if you want to get into crypto, they will start to regulate the crypto exchanges like Luno, like Valor, like Altcoin Trader, and they're encouraging them to follow FICA processes. So it's what you would call the on-ramps and the off-ramps, not trying to regulate the actual technology. And they keep saying it's around the pillars of what the SARB is trying to achieve: financial stability, inclusion, consumer protection. So they're applying those basic principles, and they're saying that it's not big enough yet to worry about from those perspectives, and systemic risk and as I say, yeah.
Okay. Right, another question we've got is, someone said they're keen to understand the level of bespokeness that a smart contract could accommodate. She said, on my current understanding, I'm not sure if smart contracts could be used for much more than a straight trades and exchange of value.
Yeah. So right now, a smart contract enables you to have, what you call an atomic swap. So it's like delivery versus payment. So you've got a house, this is the money, swap the two for each other. It's very straightforward. I think what will happen is that people are now building more advanced ones. So they're saying, in the example that I gave on the airlines, or if you've got a farmer who's taken out insurance against his crops for a hailstorm, what it will do is it will essentially go and get a weather report to say, okay, that farm was hit by hail, therefore this person needs to be paid out the insurance. So I think what will happen is we're going to have very, very simple contracts to start. As I say, that atomic swap, pay A and B on the following days. If the terms of this condition, these terms and conditions are met, pay them. I think what will happen over time is we will start to add more and more functionality, and they'll become more complex as we go on.
And do you think South Africa is, there's a lot happening from a consortium type of, looking into it, but do you think South Africa is going to advance blockchain in any way, from Department of Justice, the Department of Home Affairs, and all our...
I wish, I'm the biggest fan. I wish we would, but
like Estonia and those countries, that it's really something you could spearhead.
So we've got, the president has set up this Fourth Industrial Revolution Council. I think they're having their summit tomorrow. And this is one of the agenda items. But I don't know if we're going to see any meaningful adoption at government level that South Africa will lead anything. The Reserve Bank has been proactive, and there's some things in the pipeline that they're working on from a payments perspective, which could be very exciting. My day job is I work for Adara, so the organization that did Project Corker for the Reserve Bank, and that was putting commercial bank payments onto the blockchain. So I think the SARB is taking some sort of interest in it, but from a national level, I think it's going to take time. The other initiative, there is something else called the South African National Blockchain Alliance. It's been set up by the Department of Science and Technology, and it's been run out of that. And they're trying to get use cases off the ground to get the industry to collaborate. Identity's been recognized as one of the first ones. They were just waiting for the elections to be over for things to settle, and then they were going to try and drive something like that.
But if we are just a follower and we are not doing anything to really drive it from our side, do you think it's something lawyers should be worried about yet?
Probably not. When I worked at Straight, because I was an advocate for this, I really wanted it to come along and disrupt the securities market and eliminate all 11 intermediaries, so I could turn around and say to them, I told you so, I told you so, I was right. I said in 2015 this was going to happen. But, the markets are reluctant to change, and things take time to change. And I think it's going to be one of those cases, to be honest, where it will happen very, very slowly, and then all of a sudden we will reach that tipping point, and by then you're going to be trying to play catch up. But right now, I'm not seen at a huge level within any industry in South Africa where there's a body trying to drive major changes here. And even if we take something like identity, my immediate thing was, okay, the banks are going to love this. KYC is a mess, it's costing them a fortune, et cetera, et cetera. You'll be surprised that when you actually go into one of the banks, they've made huge advances in terms of their own internal systems around how they manage KYC, the risk profiles that they have on people. So they're seeing that identity could be beneficial, but it's not that 10x improvement where they're willing to scrap all the money that they've done, that they've invested up until now for the last 20 years and say, let's start from scratch. So the advantage of doing this right now is that the ICO and the STO world is really giving you access to a global marketplace. So if you go and register an idea right now in Switzerland, you can have access to international investors and customers that you never had access to before. And those markets are operating 24/7. People can buy and sell these tokens, and there's no friction in the chain. And I use this example, one of the stock exchanges, one of the Bitcoin exchanges started because there was a guy running, he was a gamer, and he picked up that the Chinese gamers used to play these games and they would accumulate loot during the day, so guns and lives and monsters and whatever you get in the gaming environment. And there would be American gamers who wanted some of that loot, and they were willing to buy it off the Chinese gamers, but there was no way to pay for it. So how did you enable a payment mechanism where some random guy in America can get money into a Chinese guy's bank account? And in 2011, somebody said to him, well, have you heard of Bitcoin? Why don't you make that the currency that people can use, and they can send it across the world? You don't need to know, the person doesn't have to have FICA, you don't need to know the other person's bank account. The settlement happens in 10 minutes, you can pay for the stuff immediately. And that's how Crack and this exchange started. They started as a thing to enable settlement for game loot. And I think that these ICOs are doing the same thing. They're enabling a frictionless micro payment mechanism around the world for people to have ideas where you get access to a global market, as I've said. And you don't have to go through the formal banking channels to enable those assets to move around. And I think that that's the opportunity for anybody who's got any of these ideas to do. So, I'm not saying that the energy situation is good. So don't get me wrong. But the technology is evolving where even Bitcoin, the technology is evolving. So right now, when the internet came along and our dial-up speed was appalling, where you waited 5 hours to get one picture to download or one website to download. Bitcoin is very much like that sort of thing at the moment. The transactions are taking 10 minutes to settle, so it's not feasible for you to buy a cup of coffee when the merchant wants to know whether they've been paid or not. It's hugely using up a huge amount of energy, et cetera, et cetera. But what's happening is that ecosystem, and I think there are thousands and thousands of developers who are trying to improve the Bitcoin protocol to make it faster, more energy efficient, etc. So, for example, there's just been something called the Lightning Network upgrade, which has been an upgrade to the Bitcoin system where essentially you can have micropayments. It's a wallet that sits on top of the Bitcoin blockchain to enable micropayments to happen. And then these sort of advances are reducing the energy consumption, they're making it faster. So I think what will happen is that the technology will advance and some of these things will eventually fade into obscurity around the negative aspects of it. Very much, it will take time like the internet did to develop.
But I think at the same time also energy development and the technology of creating energy is also changing a lot. If you believe in the Kurzweilian type of futures,
yes,
where
exactly.
energy is becoming, we're going to have limitless energy soon. No, well, not soon, but in 2030, you know, somewhere around.
Yeah.
So it's a parallel type of.
There's a brilliant talk on energy, if anyone's interested, by, his name is Ramiz, he's a Singularity University faculty member. And he was actually in South Africa now at the end of May, and they wanted him to go and speak to Eskom because the cost and the cost of producing electricity and the technology now that people are able to use, like in theory, we should be able to solve South Africa's energy problems overnight. Yeah. There's a talk that he does. It's available on the internet, and it's brilliant. I think, look, in theory, we're supposed to all be teaching our children how to code, so it's never a bad thing to know about that. But I don't think it's necessarily a requirement from a legal perspective to be doing it. You know, essentially what would happen is you would get in an IT service provider who would develop these sort of things for you, and they would then be tested, you know, by them and then yourselves using them all the time. So it's always good to have an understanding of it, but I don't think that it's essential that lawyers can go and read hard lines of code and be able to code themselves. You know, the front-end usability of these things is going to look, you know, very much like filling in a form. It's going to say, put in the, you know, like booking an airline ticket, put in the date, put in the amount, put in the time, you know, and so the front-end application of it is never going to require any hard coding.
I think from a lawyer perspective, the most important thing is just learning the language of coding, not necessarily being able to code, but to understand the different terminologies that there are, so that you are able to like translate the huge barrier of speaking to a developer. You know, that you know what they are capable of. So I think that's what lawyers should be learning, not necessarily the nitty-gritties of coding.
Very good question. As of today, there's no interoperability between Hyperledger, Ethereum, Bitcoin, etc. But there are startups, and that is their sole purpose. They're basically building middleware to enable the blockchains to speak to each other and to be able to read each other. And what's interesting is that these big groups are joining each other now. So, for example, the banking consortium called R3 has developed a blockchain platform called Corda. Now, they have become members of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and then Hyperledger, which is mainly driven by IBM, has also become members of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and they're now all starting to collaborate with each other and to build interoperability with each other. But as it stands as today, they don't speak to each other at all. I think it can be built both ways, but in theory, it wouldn't actually store the value. A smart contract works that if X happens, then Y will happen afterwards. It's not sitting there, as you say, as the escrow that's keeping the money, and then, you know, waiting for an instruction. It's one occurs after the other, if I can put it that way. Yes, exactly.
Great. Shall we have some wine? All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It was a wonderful session. Tanya, for coming from Joburg. Thank you so much. Hope to see you again soon.